Snow lashes a remote wooden cabin on the mountain, and a retired Marine listens as if the war is still outside. Deep in the forest, a mother wolf is spending her life like a shield, guarding her pups against the white storm. Then she appears under the porch light, wounded, limping, while her trembling pups huddle behind her. He opens the shed for shelter, not the house, offering warmth while still respecting the distance of the wild. With a soldier's experience and his German shepherd's instincts, they feel something bad is coming through the snow. That same night, one man and one dog take a lantern into the blizzard, stepping into the woods to find the truth. Would you open the door? Where are you watching from? Please like and subscribe for more. Snow had been falling for 3 days over Kestrel Peak, the kind of Vermont white that didn't decorate the world so much as erase it. Wind combed the ridge in long, angry strokes, making the old cabin complain like a tired ship, tin roof clattering, pine beams flexing, window seams sighing as if they wanted to confess something. Inside, Giddy and Gus Hale lived in the narrow space between routine and memory. 50 years old, about 6'1", broad-shouldered, with a disciplined, gym-kept solidity that didn't look like vanity so much as survival, he moved like a man who still counted corners. His face was clean-shaven, no beard to soften the angles, square jaw, sharp cheekbones, the sort of American masculinity that would have looked effortlessly heroic if not for the quiet heaviness behind it. His hair was dark brown, cut in a neat undercut, kept stubbornly clean even up here, as if order could be a small dam against the flood of thoughts. His blue-gray eyes had that steady, far-off focus of someone who'd seen violence close enough to smell it and never quite stopped listening for it. A combat injury lived in his gait, not dramatic, just a subtle drag when he turned too fast or stepped wrong on slick boards, the mountain reminding him that war left receipts. He wore only one uniform as if it were a vow he couldn't return to the armory. Marpat camouflage blouse buttoned to the collar, U.S. Marines visible on the chest, matching trousers with boxy pockets, desert combat boots dried by the stove, a tool belt at his waist with small repair bits that made him feel useful, and a black-faced luxury metal watch that ticked like a metronome for a life he'd never learned to play gently. He brewed coffee that tasted more like discipline than comfort, stared into the fire as if heat could translate the language of guilt, and spoke to silence the way some men spoke to God, carefully, without expecting a reply. Coda was the only one who answered anyway, in the way dogs do, with presence. A male German shepherd of about 5, big-boned and muscular, around 40 kilos, black and tan coat darkened along the saddle of his back, ears always upright as if the world were an endless briefing, amber brown eyes deep enough to look like polished resin. His left front paw carried a slight limp from an old fracture, a tiny hitch that never robbed him of pride. It only made him more real, more earned. He moved through the cabin like a seasoned sentry, pausing at windows, checking the seams of the door, then circling back to Gus with the dry, familiar look of a partner who had watched his human pretend he didn't need anyone. If dogs could smirk, Coda did, especially when Gus sat too long in his own head. Gus would mutter something under his breath, and Coda would blink slowly, the canine equivalent of, "Yes, sir, and the snow will stop when you stop being dramatic." The humor was small, but it mattered. It was a candle in a place that had learned to love the dark. That night, the storm pressed harder against the cabin, and even the fire sounded tired. Gus sat with his elbows on his knees, listening to the roof's metal chatter and the occasional pop of sap in the logs, when Coda froze mid-step. Ears snapped forward. Hackles rose along his shoulders. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was an uneven scrape across the porch boards and the faintest sound of labored breathing, alive, close, and wrong. Gus's body responded before his mind finished its sentence. shoulders squared, breath controlled, a calm that came not from peace but training. He rose, favoring his injured leg just enough to hate it, and moved toward the door without touching the unplugged radio or reaching for anything that could make noise. His hand hovered near the knob like it remembered the weight of other doors in other countries. He waited for the scrape again. It came. Pause. Then again, as if whoever stood outside was measuring courage in millimeters. Gus opened the door, and the blizzard lunged in, flinging snow across the floorboards like shattered glass. In the dim porch light stood a gray wolf, adult female, her coat mottled ash and winter brown, wet with ice that clung to her fur in hard beads. She was lean but not weak, the kind of animal built by hunger and hard choices. Her eyes were yellow gold, clear and unblinking. One hind leg was injured, blood dark against snow, the limb held just off the boards in a careful angle of pain. Behind her, half swallowed by white, were 4 wolf pups, small and trembling, their bodies tight to one another, round eyes bright with fear and stubborn life. They looked like little commas in the storm's sentence, waiting to see if the world would let them continue. The mother did not whine. She did not beg. She stood tall enough to make the cold seem like her ally. And she met Gus's gaze as if placing a silent oath on the threshold, not save us, but let us survive. Coda stepped forward, blocking Gus with his body, but not lunging. He sniffed once, long and deep, then went still. No growl, no bark. A decision made somewhere older than training. Gus swallowed, feeling the ache in his chest shift into something unfamiliar. Responsibility that didn't feel like a burden, but like a rope thrown to a drowning man. He spoke softly, voice rough from disuse. Easy. I'm not your enemy. The wolf's ears twitched, and she blinked once, slow, deliberate. Coda looked back at Gus, amber eyes steady as if to say, this is not prey. This is not threat. This is a mother. The storm shoved at the door again, impatient, and Gus understood something simple and brutal. Whatever had driven her here had already taken away every other option. Gus did not invite the wolves into the cabin. Compassion, he'd learned, wasn't the same as possession, and wild things died when humans loved them clumsily. Instead, he moved with the practical calm that had kept other people alive. He swung the door wider and gestured toward the separate storage shed a few meters from the cabin, an old outbuilding half sheltered by the cabin's wall and a drifted berm of snow. Not in here, he murmured, more to himself than to her. But I've got a place out of the wind. He pulled on a heavy coat over his marpat blouse, boots crunching into powder, tool belt clinking softly, and limped his way across the short distance with Coda at his heel. The shed door stuck. He shouldered it open with a grunt that was half irritation, half relief to feel his body doing something useful. Inside, it smelled of old lumber, oil, and dry straw. He dragged out pallets and a section of wire mesh, making a quick barrier that created a cornered space, open enough to breathe, separated enough to keep distance. He spread straw thickly, then set down a shallow pan of warm water and a bowl of food. Canned meat warmed near the stove, mixed with melted snow until it was soft. He placed everything, then backed away, hands open, giving the wolves what all frightened beings needed first: space. Coda stood at the shed entrance, posture alert but controlled, a silent gate that said, "You are allowed in, but no one is allowed to hurt my human." The wolf mother watched Gus's hands with a predator's precision, tracking every movement, weighing intention. Then she stepped forward, slow, careful, her injured leg making her posture subtly uneven. One pup edged after her, then another, then all 4, their tiny bodies pressing into her wake like they were following the only story they trusted. The mother crossed the threshold of the shed, tested the straw with her paws, and lowered her head to sniff the water. She didn't drink right away. She turned her head and looked back at Gus again, and in that look there was something that felt almost like recognition. Not personal, not sentimental, but the sharp understanding of two survivors who had both carried others through places that wanted them dead. Gus was about to close the shed door part way, leave a gap for air, shield them from wind, when Coda's body snapped tense again, not at the wolves, past them, toward the tree line that the storm had turned into a pale blur. Coda moved to the edge of the porch light and lifted his nose, nostrils flaring as if the cold itself carried a message. Then he did something that jolted Gus more than any scratch at the door. Coda whined, once, low, not fear but warning, and pawed at the snow near the shed threshold, digging fast enough to expose the hard-packed layer beneath. The sound was wrong, hollow, like the snow sat on a pocket of air. Gus froze. His mind, trained to find traps, translated the sensation into a single word he hated: unstable. The mountain gave a deep, distant thump. Not thunder, not a falling tree, but a dull pulse through the ground, subtle enough that a less trained man might have dismissed it as imagination. Coda stared into the white and held that stare as if he could see through weather. Gus felt his throat tighten. He had come up here to escape the feeling that the world could change in a second. Yet here was that feeling again, delivered not by gunfire, but by a dog's instinct and a mountain's breath. The wolf mother, sensing the shift, stiffened too, her ears pricking, her pups pressing closer to her belly. For a heartbeat, human, dog, and wolf were aligned by the same ancient logic. The storm was not the only danger moving tonight. Gus's hand hovered over the shed door. He didn't close it. He left it open a fraction wider than planned, as if making room not just for wolves, but for whatever truth the night was carrying toward him. He returned to the cabin and brought another blanket, tearing it into strips without thinking. Hands that had once tied tourniquets, now folding warmth for wild pups. Coda followed, glancing between Gus and the tree line with a vigilance that looked uncomfortably like duty. Gus placed the blanket pieces inside the shed, then retreated again. The mother wolf finally drank, slow and steady, then nudged the bowl toward her pups with the gentle authority of a parent who could not afford softness. The pups lapped clumsily, tongues too small for the job, spilling more than they swallowed, and Gus felt a brief, absurd flicker of humor. Even in blizzards, children were messy. It was the first time his mouth almost remembered how to smile. Then the mother settled, curling her body around the pups like a living wall, her injured leg tucked carefully, eyes half closed, but never truly asleep. Coda sat beside Gus on the porch, snow dusting his back, ears still forward. Gus's fingers were numb, but his chest felt, if not warm, at least less frozen. He looked at the shed, then at the door he'd opened, and understood with quiet clarity that some rescues weren't heroic. They were simply refusals to become the kind of man who closed his door and called it peace. The cabin light spilled into the storm like a small beacon, and the wind, for all its cruelty, could not reach the circle of straw where 4 pups breathed under their mother's ribs. Gus exhaled, long and controlled, the way he used to after firefights when everyone was counted and the living had permission to shake. Coda leaned his shoulder lightly against Gus's leg, gentle, grounded, and Gus let the contact happen. No speech, no vow, just a man and a dog acknowledging that tonight the door had been worth opening. When Gus finally turned to go back inside, Coda remained on the porch, watching the white dark with the seriousness of a soldier. And in that stillness, Gus felt the smallest beginning of something that resembled faith. Not faith in miracles, but faith that doing the right thing could still change the shape of a life. The storm didn't end so much as change its mind. By morning, the wind had backed off from a scream to a steady, resentful hiss, and the snow fell in thicker, slower flakes that looked almost gentle until they piled in corners and tried to bury the world again. Gus rose before dawn the way he always did, not because he was rested, but because his body refused to forget duty. The cabin was dim, the fire reduced to patient coals. His breath hung briefly in the air when he stepped out, marpat collar buttoned tight, desert boots biting into crusted drifts, the black-faced watch ticking against his wrist like a reminder that time moved even when people tried to hide from it. Coda was already there, German shepherd shoulders squared, ears up, amber eyes cutting through the gray. He didn't bark. He didn't pace. He simply stood and watched the shed, the way a good soldier watches a doorway. Calm, vigilant, ready. Gus crossed the few meters to the outbuilding with his slight limp, carrying a small kit, antiseptic wipes, clean cloth strips torn from an old flannel, a roll of gauze he kept for his own leg when it flared. He stopped at the threshold and didn't step in. The wolf mother lay inside on the straw, body curved around her 4 pups like a living barricade. Her coat had dried into a rough, ice-crusted tapestry of ash and brown. The injury on her hind leg was still angry, dark blood against pale straw, the limb tucked in a careful angle of pain. But her eyes were steady. She watched Gus's hands, not his face. That told him everything. She trusted motion more than intention. Gus set the kit down near the entrance, then backed away a full step. Only when he was no longer over her did he speak, soft and even. "I'm going to help your leg. I'm not going to touch your babies." The wolf didn't move, but her ears twitched. Coda remained beside Gus, slightly angled forward, not as a threat, but as a boundary. His presence said, in a language older than words, that this space had rules now. Gus extended one arm slowly, palm down, and slid an antiseptic wipe across the snow-dusted floor toward the wolf. It was a strange offering, human cleanliness in a wild den, but it was all he had. He waited. After a long moment, the wolf shifted forward just enough for Gus to see her breath fog, then she withdrew again, as if testing the line and finding it acceptable. Gus took that as permission, not to close distance, but to do the work with respect. He didn't reach for her leg. Instead, he placed a shallow pan of warm water near the straw, then a warmed bowl of food farther away from the pups, making it easier for her to eat without leaving them exposed. The pups stirred, tiny bodies trembling, noses rooting at the air. One squeaked, thin as a match's first flare. The mother immediately lowered her head to nudge it close, her muzzle gentle, her eyes never leaving Gus. When she finally ate, she did it the way exhausted parents do. 2 quick mouthfuls, then she stopped and turned back to her pups, pushing the bowl a fraction toward them, as if the last of her strength belonged to their stomachs. Gus felt the old ache in his chest shift. Love, he thought, was a creature that kept giving even when it had nothing left. Coda exhaled through his nose, a quiet huff, as if agreeing. Gus waited for a lull in the mother's attention, then took the antiseptic wipe and pressed it to his own palm first, letting her see the motion. He cleaned his hand like a ritual of safety. Then, keeping his body angled sideways, non-threatening, he reached in only to the point of the shed's doorway and extended the wipe toward the injured hind leg without crossing fully into her space. The wolf's lips tightened, not a snarl, but a warning. Gus stopped instantly. He didn't argue with the mother in pain. He set the wipe down again and retreated. "All right," he murmured. "We'll do this your way." He fetched a long, flat piece of wood, slid it along the straw like a bridge, and placed the wipe at the end of it, close enough to her leg that she could reach it with her own muzzle. Then he backed away. The wolf stared at the offering. Then, slowly, suspiciously, she lowered her head and used her teeth to tug the cloth closer. She pressed it to the wound herself, not expertly, but with the stubborn intelligence of an animal determined to survive. Gus watched, astonished at the simple dignity of it. Coda's ears flicked toward Gus as if to say, "Told you? Don't rush the wild." Hours passed in a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Gus warming water, setting food, stepping back. The wolf eating sparingly, tending her pups, adjusting her body to shield them. Coda standing guard between cabin and shed like a living fence. The storm softened, then thickened again. Snow slid off the eaves. Somewhere in the woods, a tree cracked under weight with a sound like a slow gunshot. Gus kept his movements minimal, his voice low. The cabin had taught him silence. The wolves demanded it. By late morning, faint tracks appeared on the ridge road, tread marks sharper than snow's own sculpting. Gus saw them first from the porch window, then Coda saw them too, posture tightening, tail steady, not wagging. A distant engine whined, and then grew louder, a mechanical insect fighting uphill. Gus's hand hovered near the door latch. Not fear, just readiness. He stepped onto the porch, the pale light flattening the world into shades of bone and slate. A tracked snowmobile ATV hybrid, wide skis in front, rubber tracks in back, climbed into view through the drifting white. It stopped with a final cough of exhaust. The rider swung off with practiced balance, Ranger Lila Hart. She was 38, athletic in the quiet way of someone who lived outdoors year-round, not bulky but tough. Shoulders squared under a forest green USFS parka with a patch on the sleeve. Her dark hair was pulled into a low tie beneath a knit cap, no stray curls allowed to flirt with the wind. Her face was angular, eyes sharp and intelligent, the kind that measured distances fast and read lies even faster. She carried a radio on her shoulder and moved with a calm that didn't need to announce itself. Her expression softened only slightly when she saw Gus, like someone who'd been trained to expect trouble but still hoped for decency. "You've had your porch light on all night," she called, voice firm, cutting clean through the wind. "That's either a kindness or an emergency." Gus answered with his usual dry economy. "Depends who's asking." Lila's eyes flicked to Coda. The German shepherd stood close to Gus's leg, ears forward, calm, but clearly in charge of his own boundaries. The faint limp in his left forepaw didn't diminish the authority in his stance. Lila nodded once, acknowledging the dog like a colleague. "He's not just a pet," she said. Gus's mouth twitched. "No, he's my union rep." Lila almost smiled, then caught herself, professionalism snapping back into place. She stepped closer, boots crunching, and her gaze slid past Gus toward the shed. "I tracked Prince near the patrol line," she said, voice lowered as if the mountain itself could overhear. "Big. Not deer, not coyote." Gus didn't deny it. He just turned slightly, letting her see the shed door ajar, a careful crack. Lila exhaled slowly, a sound that held both sympathy and calculation. "Wolves," she said, not surprised but concerned. "And pups." Gus nodded. "4." Lila's eyes narrowed. She was weighing two laws at once. The law of the wild said, "Let the wild be wild." The law of people said, "Don't interfere, don't habituate, don't make a predator dependent." Yet the law of weather didn't care about policy. It killed indiscriminately. She walked toward the shed but stopped well short of the threshold, mirroring Gus's respect for distance. She crouched, her gloved hand hovering near the straw, and listened. Inside, the pups made their small, thin noises. The mother wolf shifted, a low, warning rumble deep in her chest. Lila froze instantly, hands open, posture humble. "Easy," she said softly. "I'm not here to take you." She glanced at Gus. "You did the right thing keeping them separate," she said. "Cabin warmth is tempting. That's how dependency starts." Gus nodded once, the compliment landing heavier than it sounded. Lila reached into her pack and pulled out supplies: electrolyte powder, sterile pads, a small bottle of antiseptic, and a thicker bandage wrap designed for field injuries. "Storm like this," she murmured, "I can't relocate them safely. Roads are too bad, and tranquilizer in this cold is a gamble." She paused, eyes hardening with reality. But keeping them long-term is also a problem. Wolves live by distance. Gus's voice stayed level. "I'm not trying to tame anything." Lila's gaze slid to Coda again. "Then you understand the difference between rescue and ownership." Gus gave a short, humorless breath that almost passed for a laugh. "I only officially serve one German shepherd. The others are temporary renters." That did it. Lila's mouth twitched, a quick flash of amusement like sunlight breaking through cloud. Then she became serious again, because seriousness was part of her job and possibly part of her nature. "Here's the deal," she said. "You keep doing what you're doing. Minimal contact, food placed and stepped away from, no voices raised, no staring them down. I'll mark this as an emergency shelter situation. Temporary. If anyone asks, you didn't lure them in. You provided a buffer against weather." She handed Gus the electrolyte powder and bandages. Her eyes held his, steady. "And if the mother can't walk when this clears, you call me. Not a neighbor, not a social media hero, me." Gus took the supplies, his large hands careful, as if receiving something fragile. "Understood." Lila looked at his Marpat uniform, the neat undercut, the clean-shaven jaw, and the watch that looked too expensive for a man living in a half-creaking cabin. She didn't ask questions, maybe because she could already see answers in the way his shoulders never fully relaxed. "You're up here alone," she said, not as accusation, more as observation. Gus shrugged, a controlled motion. "Not anymore." Coda's ears flicked, as if approving the honesty. Lila stood, brushed snow from her knee, and glanced toward the ridge beyond the cabin. "One more thing," she said. "Wolves don't move pups like this unless they have a reason. Den collapse, flood, pressure." Her voice tightened slightly, and Gus remembered Coda digging at the snow, the hollow sound beneath, the distant thump that had traveled through the mountain like a heartbeat. "I felt something last night," Gus said quietly. "Not thunder." Lila's eyes sharpened. "The mountain?" Gus nodded. Lila's expression went very still, the way some people go still when they remember something that taught them fear. "There's an old slope above the north face," she said. "Avalanche history. Nothing major in years, but storms rewrite rules." Gus looked past her at the whiteness, at the ridge line blurred by falling snow. The story in his head changed shape. This wasn't just a mother wolf seeking shelter. This was a signal, a displacement, a warning delivered on 4 trembling paws. Rehook, tss, mid-chapter. As Lila spoke, Coda suddenly moved, not toward the shed, but toward the porch edge where the wind carved a thin, wavering ribbon of snow. He lowered his head and sniffed, then lifted his muzzle high, nostrils flaring. He didn't bark. Instead, he made a sound Gus had heard only a handful of times, a low, strained whine that carried urgency without panic. Then Coda pressed his paw hard against the porch boards and looked directly at Gus, holding eye contact longer than usual, as if demanding translation. Gus followed Coda's gaze up the slope. For a heartbeat, the snowfall thinned, and through the gray he saw it, a faint line running across the mountain's face, subtle as a scar under skin. A fracture line, not wide, not obvious, but there, cutting a quiet seam through the snowpack. Lila saw it too. Her face tightened. "That's new," she whispered. The wolf mother in the shed rumbled again, not warning this time, but something closer to agitation, as if she felt the mountain's unease through her bones. In that moment, Gus felt the hairs rise on his arms beneath the uniform. The storm had brought wolves to his door, but the wolves had brought him a question the mountain wanted answered. What else was about to move? Lila backed away from the line of sight, turning her head as if listening to the slope. "I need to report this," she said quickly. "If that seam opens, it could slide." Gus's mind went to the town below without choosing to. He didn't even know all their names, and yet the idea of them asleep under roofs that didn't know what was coming made his chest tighten. Lila mounted her machine, engine roaring again. "Keep them stable," she said, "and keep yourself alive. If you hear another thump, if the cabin shudders, don't argue with the mountain. You move." Gus nodded once. "Copy." Lila glanced at him, a brief look that held respect and something like worry. "You're doing a dangerous kindness," she said, "but you're doing it right." Then she drove off, her tracks quickly swallowed by falling snow. The world went quiet again, and Gus stood on the porch with Coda pressed close, feeling the strange intersection of laws, forest law, human law, and the law of gravity waiting above them. That night, after Gus mixed electrolyte powder into warm water and set it by the shed, after he placed antiseptic and clean cloth within reach the way he'd learned the wolf preferred, he returned to the cabin and didn't sit by the fire. He stood by the window instead, watching the slope through the drifting white. Coda sat at his feet, ears angled toward the mountain, body still as carved wood. The distant sound came again hours later, a muffled boom far up the ridge, like the earth shifting in its sleep. The cabin didn't shake, but something inside Gus did. He thought of the wolf mother walking into a human's light, something no wild creature did without desperation. He thought of Coda's warning, the seam on the slope, Lila's tightened voice. Gus realized with a cold clarity that felt both cursed and familiar that the storm was only the first act, and the mountain, like an old judge, was preparing to deliver its verdict. He didn't sleep much. He kept the porch light on, not because he wanted company, because he wanted to be ready when the world knocked again. Morning didn't arrive like a clean promise. It seeped in, thin and pale, turning the world outside Gus's cabin into a frozen watercolor. Pine silhouettes, gray sky, snow that looked soft until it broke under a boot-like glass. The storm had loosened its grip, but it hadn't let go. The porch boards still creaked with cold, and the mountains wore their white like armor. Gus stepped out in his Marpat uniform, collar up, buttons fastened, desert boots laced tight. The fabric made him look like a man who could belong anywhere except the life he'd chosen. A half-collapsed cabin on Kestrel Peak, and a silence so thick it felt like a second skin. His limp was faint but honest, a reminder of war that refused to become a story you told at parties. Coda moved beside him with the steady confidence of a trained German shepherd who had learned how to read a man's mood the way others read weather. 5 years old, large and muscular, black and tan coat darkened along the back, upright ears always tuned to trouble, amber eyes that held depth like old whiskey. His left front paw carried a subtle hitch from a long-ago fracture, but the rest of him made up for it, shoulders solid, chest broad, stance proud. The scorched K9 harness Gus kept inside was a relic, a reminder that the dog had once worn duty like a second hide. Out here, Coda didn't need a badge to be a protector. He had instinct, and he had Gus. The shed door stood closed but not locked. Gus had learned fast. In the wild, you didn't trap gratitude. You offered shelter, and let the creature decide whether mercy was safe. When he opened the shed, the wolf mother lifted her head, gray coat matted and iced, eyes bright with fatigue. Her pups were tucked close, 4 small bodies curled into a single, breathing knot. The injury on her hind leg looked cleaner than before. Less wet blood, more dried crust, proof she'd used the supplies he'd left the way a soldier uses a field kit. She didn't growl. She watched. Coda stayed at the threshold, not advancing, not challenging, simply present. The wolf mother held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. An animal's version of diplomacy. Gus set fresh water and a small portion of food down and backed off. He was turning to leave when Coda moved, not toward the wolves, but away from them, toward the tree line, head low, sniffing the air as if someone had spilled a secret on the wind. Gus recognized the change immediately. Coda's posture tightened, not with fear, but with purpose. The dog looked back once, then again, and gave a short, insistent huff. It wasn't a request. It was an order delivered in canine grammar. Come, now. Gus hesitated, because the cabin, the shed, the fragile truce behind him all felt like a thin island of control. But Coda's eyes held that familiar, unblinking certainty, the kind that had saved men in places where maps lied and radios failed. Gus grabbed a small day pack, shoved in a flashlight, a length of rope, and a folding tool, then stepped into the woods. The mountains swallowed them fast. Snow muffled everything, turning Gus's boots into slow drum beats and Coda's paws into whispers. The pines stood heavy with ice, branches bowed low, occasionally shedding powder with a soft sigh. Under the snow, the ground felt uneven, packed in some places, hollow in others. Gus's body remembered how to move in hostile terrain. Weight forward, eyes scanning, breath controlled. Coda led with his nose like a divining rod, weaving between trunks, circling once when the wind shifted, then cutting down the north slope where the trees grew tighter and the light dimmed. Gus followed, letting the dog's confidence drag him away from his own reluctance. As they descended, Gus noticed signs that didn't belong to a natural storm. A snapped sapling cut too cleanly, a length of bright plastic ribbon half buried in snow, a straight line of disturbed earth beneath the white, as if someone had tried to erase a trail and failed. Coda stopped at a patch where the snow looked slightly darker, as if warmed from below. He sniffed, then scraped once with his good paw, exposing a smear of mud and a tuft of gray fur. Gus crouched, gloved fingers probing gently. The smell hit him. Animal, milk, damp earth, faint but unmistakable. A den, or what had been one. He scanned the bank ahead and found it. An old hollow near the base of a root system, partly collapsed, its entrance caved in by snow and churned mud. The ground around it was pocked with shallow depressions, paw marks, and frantic scrapes. The storm had done damage, yes, but something else had too. There was a harshness to the destruction, a blunt force that felt like interference. Gus leaned closer and saw a scatter of pale stone dust mixed into the snow, powdery, unnatural, like drilled rock. Nearby, half buried in frost, lay a short piece of blackened cord, edges melted, stiff with cold. Coda's hackles rose. He didn't bark. He stared at the cord as if it offended him. Gus's jaw tightened. Cord like that didn't come from wolves or weather. His eyes tracked outward and caught faint parallel grooves in the snow leading to the den site, wide, shallow, too uniform to be a deer trail. Track marks, the kind left by machinery with treads. Gus stood slowly, the limp in his leg suddenly more noticeable as his body tensed. So that's why, he murmured, though no one asked the question aloud. The wolf mother hadn't wandered. She'd been displaced. He moved along the bank, following the faint track line, until it crossed a patch of exposed rock where the snow had been blown thin. There, hammered into the stone, was a metal stake topped with a neon cap, a survey marker. Next to it, a small rectangular sign, the kind contractors planted like flags of ownership, was wedged into the snow. Gus brushed it clear with his glove. The letters were bold and industrial. Northline Aggregate. Below, in smaller print, Site Prep. Authorized personnel only. Gus stared at it until the words felt like an insult. Aggregate meant gravel. Gravel meant blasting. Blasting meant vibration through the mountain's bones, and above them, somewhere beyond the tree line, was the seam Lila had seen. A fresh fracture line in the snowpack, subtle but real. Gus looked up the slope and felt the air itself change, as if the mountain were holding its breath. Coda moved ahead, suddenly quicker, circling to a wide clearing where the snow lay smooth like a sheet, pulled tight. The dog stopped dead, ears pricked, nose high. Then he began to dig. Not playful digging, the frantic, purposeful kind. Snow flew back in pale arcs. Gus limped forward, crouched beside him, and helped with his gloved hands. Within seconds, the shovel of snow revealed a long, thin crack running across the surface like a hairline fracture in glass. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't yawn open like a movie. It just existed, quiet and wrong. Coda whined, low in his throat, then pressed his paw carefully near the edge and pulled back, as if the ground beneath was fragile. Gus leaned closer. Under the crack, he heard it. A hollow, rushing sound, faint but steady. Water moving beneath the snowpack. Rain on snow, meltwater. A lubricant beneath a heavy load. His stomach tightened the way it had in combat, when the world went too quiet, and you knew something was about to happen. Gus had seen avalanche videos in training, had heard the talk, how the snowpack could layer like lies, how one weak layer could turn the whole mountain into a weapon. But this wasn't theory anymore. This was a warning, written in physics, and if Northline Aggregate had been drilling or blasting nearby, the vibration could have nudged a precarious slope closer to failure. Gus's mind snapped into the old Marine rhythm. Identify threat, assess risk, act. The threat wasn't a human with a weapon, it was gravity with patience. He turned to Coda. The German shepherd stood rigid, eyes locked on Gus, then looked back at the crack, then back again, like a messenger who refused to leave until the message was received. Gus exhaled slowly. "You brought me here," he said, voice low. "Not her." Coda's tail flicked once, short and sharp. Yes. The wolf mother had led her pups to safety by instinct. Coda had led Gus to the why. Gus took out his phone. No signal. Of course, the mountain loved isolation. He looked around, eyes scanning for any clue that could become proof. He snapped photos anyway, sign, stake, blackened cord, crack line. Then he pulled a strip of orange fabric from his pack, old survey tape he'd used around the property, and tied it to a low branch, marking the spot like a wound dressing on the mountain. As he worked, a memory hit him. Flash of a different terrain, a different kind of crack. A road in a foreign place where dust rose after an explosion, where a man's scream turned into silence too fast. Gus clenched his jaw until the ache passed. He wasn't there anymore. He was here. And here still had time. Coda suddenly froze. His ears swung toward the upper slope, and his whole body tightened as if bracing for impact. Gus felt it too. Not a sound, more a pressure, a sensation in the feet. Then came the muffled whoomph, a deep, hollow collapse noise, like a giant exhaling under the snow. Gus's blood went cold. That sound wasn't thunder. That sound was a weak layer failing. Coda let out a sharp bark, one, then two, commanding, urgent. He didn't run. He stared uphill, then snapped his head toward the trail back. Move now. Gus didn't argue. They turned, climbing fast, the limp in Gus's leg becoming a burning protest. Coda stayed close enough to bump Gus's thigh when he faltered, guiding him like a living handrail. Behind them, the mountains stayed quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you feel watched. They reached the ridgeline breathless, and only then did Gus look back. The crack line was still there, but the snow surface near it had subtly changed, slumped a fraction, like a chest after a breath released. It hadn't slid. Not yet. But it had spoken. Gus and Coda returned to the cabin by late afternoon, both coated in frost. Gus checked the shed first. The wolf mother was still there, eyes alert, pups breathing in a small heap. She rose slightly when he entered, favoring the injured leg, and for a moment Gus saw something in her posture that felt uncomfortably familiar, the stubborn refusal to fall until the mission was complete. He set food and water down and backed away, but his gaze lingered on the pups. They were alive because she'd moved them. And if Gus didn't move the town, others might not be so lucky. Coda sat beside Gus on the porch as the pale light faded. The German shepherd's breath puffed steady in the cold, his amber eyes tracking the slope line as if he could see through trees in time. Gus looked at the mountains and felt his heart tap a rhythm he hadn't felt in years, fear sharpened into purpose. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than the dog, "I believe you." Coda leaned his shoulder into Gus's leg, a firm, grounding press that felt like agreement. In the shed, the wolf mother shifted, settling her body around her pups as the wind rose again. The mountain held its breath. Gus held his. And somewhere between them, a four-legged compass had pointed a soldier back toward responsibility, toward people he hadn't planned to care about, and a warning he couldn't ignore. Gus didn't wait for the mountain to shout louder. He'd heard enough quiet warnings in his life to know that danger often speaks in whispers first. An odd pressure in the air, a hairline crack, a sound like a buried breath collapsing. Back at the cabin, the shed light glowed faintly through the drifting snow, and inside that separate, unclaimed shelter, the gray wolf mother lay curved around her pups like a living barricade. Gus kept the distance he'd promised, mercy without possession, yet the sight of her still tightened something in him, not tenderness alone, but responsibility. Coda stayed close at his heel, 5 years old, and built like a working dog carved from winter. Black and tan coat heavy along the back, amber eyes bright and unblinking, ears pricked toward every shift of wind. The slight hitch in his left front paw never slowed him when it mattered. He moved through the cabin with a soldier's quiet, making rounds without being asked, as if the whole mountain were a perimeter that needed guarding. Gus used the tool he'd avoided for months, the radio. It sat on a shelf like a guilty conscience, dusted, half forgotten, a link to other human voices he'd trained himself not to need. He powered it up, thumb steady, and the speaker crackled with static that sounded like snowfall in a tin can. He keyed the mic with a practiced calm that came from his Marine years, breath controlled, words clean. "Hart, this is Kestrel Peak Cabin. You on?" A pause. Then a familiar voice cut through, sharp and focused, the way only someone accustomed to being responsible could be. "So, copy, Kestrel. This is Ranger Lila Hart. You okay up there?" Lila's tone carried the same discipline she wore on patrol. Composed, no wasted emotion. In Gus's mind, she appeared as she had in the stormlight, mid-30s, athletic and lean, dark hair tucked under a wool cap, cheeks wind-chapped, eyes keen as flint. She had the posture of a person who didn't lean on faith blindly. She leaned on protocols, maps, and what her boots told her. "Not calling for myself," Gus said. "I found a crack line on the north slope, water running beneath the snowpack. Evidence of drilling near an old den site. Company marker, North Line aggregate." Silence, then Lila's exhale. "Give me coordinates." Gus read them off, then added, "I took photos, track marks, burned cord, survey stake." "Stay put," Lila replied. "I'm looping this to County Emergency Management. And Gus, don't play hero alone." Gus's mouth tightened in a humorless half-smile. "That ship left the dock years ago." "Then let it sink somewhere safe," she snapped back, and despite the sharpness, it sounded like care. He checked the shed once more. Water topped, food set farther back. Everyo to prevent dependence, straw fluffed. The wolf mother watched him with those steady eyes that didn't plead, didn't thank, didn't bargain. She simply endured. Coda stood at the threshold, still as a statue, as if his presence was a treaty. Gus moved to the cabin door, pulled on his Marpat uniform jacket, cinched his tool belt, and glanced at the black-faced luxury watch on his wrist. An odd contrast against camouflage, like a reminder that time didn't care what a man used to be. "We're going down," he told Coda. The dog's ears lifted, tail low, ready. The descent to Pine Haven wasn't a road so much as a stubborn line carved through forest and snow. Gus drove his old truck slow, chains biting into ice, headlights cutting the white like two tired eyes. Coda rode upright in the passenger seat, nose working, shoulders tense. Every so often he'd let out a short huff at a passing gust, as if arguing with the wind. Gus kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near his pocket knife, an old habit that had nothing to do with wolves or avalanches and everything to do with memories that never fully unstrapped. Pine Haven appeared below like a handful of warm lights scattered in a bowl of snow. A small northern town that tried to look brave in winter. A diner with a neon sign buzzing through frost. A hardware store with salt bags stacked like sandbags. A church steeple that pointed at the sky as if asking it to be kinder. Gus parked near the town hall and stepped out into air that smelled of wood smoke and diesel. Heads turned. People knew of him, the man on the peak who didn't come down unless he had to. Some regarded him with curiosity, others with the wary discomfort reserved for loners and veterans who carried their silence like a weapon. Inside, the town hall was bright and crowded, heated to a dry warmth that made Gus's skin feel too exposed. Folding chairs, boots stamping snow, coats hung over railings. A meeting was underway. At the front, a projector screen showed a clean, cheerful rendering of a new access road expansion with arrows and promises. A man in a polished wool coat spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never had to dig a friend out of rubble. He had a sharp face, neatly trimmed beard, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Northline Aggregate is proud to partner with Pine Haven," he said. "Jobs, safer transit, improved commerce." Gus felt Coda's posture stiff beside him. The dog's nose twitched, head turning slightly toward the man, then toward the back doors, as if tracking an invisible trail, the scent of oil maybe, or something sharper. Gus walked down the aisle, boots heavy on the floor, and the room quieted in that way crowds do when a storm has entered the building wearing a human body. Lila stood near the side wall, parka unzipped, radio clipped to her shoulder, arms crossed. Her expression said she'd expected him, but not this soon. Gus set his phone on the front table, turned the screen outward, and placed printed coordinates on top like a warrant. "This isn't about your slides," he said, voice low but carrying. "The north slope above town is fractured. Water's running under the snowpack. There's drilling near a den site. You're sitting under a loaded roof." A few people scoffed. Someone muttered, "He's paranoid." A woman in a knit hat whispered, "That's the mountain man." Gus didn't flinch. He'd been called worse by better men. The Northline representative raised his brows, still smiling. "Sir, we're operating within our permits. There's no evidence our activity—" "There is," Gus cut in and flicked through photos, survey stake, burned cord, track grooves, the crack line. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid the mountain's testimony on the table. Lila stepped forward. "I verified the marker location," she said. "Tracks are consistent with tracked machinery. The den site shows disturbance beyond storm damage." At that, the mayor, an older man with tired eyes and a soft belly from too many winters, rubbed his temple. "We need someone who can speak to slope stability," he said, "not just feelings." And that was when Silas Wren stood. He rose from the second row slowly, like a man whose joints had negotiated with cold for decades. Silas was in his late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, white hair combed back, wireframe glasses perched low on a long nose. He wore a tweed coat that smelled faintly of old books and coffee, and he held himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd been ignored enough to stop craving applause. "I can," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Retired geologist, 30 years with State Survey. "I came tonight because I don't trust pretty renderings." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the room, and Silas allowed himself a thin smile. Humor, like a flare, could light a path without burning it. He asked to see the photos. Gus handed the phone over. Silas studied the crack line, the marker, the slope coordinates, and then he looked up at the projector map like it offended him personally. "You've had heavy snow for days," Silas said, tapping the screen. "Then a temperature lift. Rain on snow is a known destabilizer. If water is running beneath the slab, it reduces friction. Add vibration, drilling, tracked vehicles, then you're encouraging failure." Someone in the back asked, "Are you saying avalanche?" Silas shook his head slightly. "Could be a slab release. Could be a landslide beneath snowpack. Either way, the mountain doesn't care what we call it." The Northline man's smile tightened. "With respect, this is speculative." "With respect," Silas returned, eyes calm, "speculation is what gets people killed when they refuse to evacuate until a hillside introduces itself through their living room." The room shifted. Doubt leaned toward fear. And fear, when honest, can become wisdom. Coda suddenly growled, not at Gus, not at the crowd, but at the back doors. The sound was low, controlled, a working dog warning that prickled every spine in the room. People turned. Through the glass, a pair of headlights approached, too bright, too close. A tracked utility vehicle rolled past the building on the road outside, engine rattling, undercarriage clanking like teeth. As it passed, Coda lunged forward just enough for Gus to catch his collar, and the dog's nose flared hard, eyes sharp. Gus smelled it a heartbeat later. Diesel, and something metallic sour beneath. An echo of explosives from another life. At that exact second, the town hall lights flickered. Not a full outage, just a stutter, like the building blinked. Then a distant boom, muted, deep, traveling through the floor more than the air. The kind of sound you feel in your bones before you hear it. Silence followed, thick as snow. No one spoke. The mayor's mouth opened and closed like a man searching for the old world where meetings stayed polite. Lila was already reaching for her radio. Silas's face went very still. Gus released Coda's collar slowly, his pulse steady in that terrible way it used to be in combat. Calmness born from knowing exactly what comes next if you do nothing. "That," Gus said quietly, "is the mountain answering." The mayor stood. "Emergency management," he barked, voice suddenly more sheriff than politician. "Do we have authority to order evacuation?" Lila's radio crackled as she spoke into it, fast, crisp. "Requesting immediate activation, pre-evac advisory for Pine Haven Lower Valley and East Ridge. Potential slope failure on Kestrel North Face." The reply came garbled but clear enough. "Copy, stand by. Initiate local procedures." Northline's representative stepped forward, protest rising, but the room had shifted past him. A mother in the front row clutched her child closer. An elderly man muttered a prayer. Someone whispered, "My cats." And another voice answered with strained humor, "Bring the cats. Bring the attitude, too." Even Gus felt the corner of his mouth twitch, not joy, but the small human relief of shared ridiculousness in the face of fear. The mayor began assigning tasks: school gym as staging point, church basement for warming, buses for seniors, sheriff's deputies to do door-to-door in the lower streets. Lila coordinated with the county, her face sharp with focus. Silas scribbled quick slope notes, drawing a rough hazard boundary with a pen that shook slightly, not from age, but from urgency. Gus didn't take command. He didn't need to, but he became what he had always been, the steady hand that moves when others freeze. He offered his truck for transport. He handed Silas the coordinates again to double-check. He told the mayor which roads would ice first. Coda stayed pressed to his leg like an anchor, watching doors, watching windows, watching the way fear moves through a room like invisible smoke. When the meeting broke into motion, Gus stepped outside into the falling snow. The town's warning siren, a single old unit mounted near the firehouse, began to wail, a long, rising cry that made the hair on Gus's arms stand up. The mountain's bell, answered by metal and electricity. Pine Haven stirred like an anthill disturbed. Headlights shouted names, doors slamming, boots pounding porches. Gus watched people move, mothers carrying blankets, fathers hauling dog crates, neighbors knocking on doors. He saw the line of humanity stretching into the street and felt something unfamiliar: belonging. Not the easy belonging of parties and laughter, but the hard belonging of a community choosing life together. He looked down at Coda. The dog's amber eyes met his, steady as ever. Not proud, not begging, simply present, as if to say, "This is what opening a door means." Gus's gaze lifted to the dark outline of Kestrel Peak above the town. Somewhere up there, in a shed lit faintly against the trees, a wolf mother curled around her pups, trusting a stranger's distance. Gus exhaled into the snow. "If we save them," he murmured, not sure if he meant the town or himself. "It started with your nose." Coda sneezed as a snowflake landed on his muzzle, then leaned into Gus's thigh like a teammate making a joke without words. And for the first time in a long time, Gus didn't feel like the mountain man watching life from afar. He felt like part of the line of footprints being laid down, one urgent step at a time. Night didn't arrive gently over Pine Haven. It arrived like a lid shut on a pot already boiling. The evacuation had emptied most streets, yet the town still felt awake, lights burning in the school gym, a church basement humming with space heaters, the firehouse radio spilling clipped voices into the cold. Gus stood outside the staging area with snow crusting his shoulders, the marpat fabric stiff with frost, his clean-shaven jaw set in that quiet way men do when they've learned panic is a luxury. Coda pressed close at his left leg, black and tan coat bristling under the porch light, amber eyes scanning the dark like twin lanterns. The dog's slight limp was there, a subtle hitch in his front paw, but his focus was unbroken, his posture proud as if the whole valley were his assignment. Gus didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a hinge, one of those small, overlooked things that only matter when a door has to swing at the right moment. Lila Hart moved through the crowd with practiced-yet speed, parka hood up, dark hair tucked away, cheeks red from the bite of wind. She spoke into her radio in short bursts, calm the way a winter river is calm, because it's deep, not because it's safe. Beside her stood Silas Renon, the retired geologist, wrapped in a tweed coat that made him look like a professor dragged out of a library and dropped into a blizzard. His wire-frame glasses fogged every time he spoke, and he kept wiping them clean with a handkerchief, as if clarity itself were a duty. Near the bus line, a new figure argued with a volunteer, voice sharp with fear disguised as authority. He was a sheriff's deputy, square-shouldered, late 40s, with a thick mustache and a face weathered by cheap coffee and long nights. His name patch read Barnes. He had the kind of eyes that measured everyone for trouble first and humanity second. "We can't keep the road closed all night," he insisted. "People will try to go back for belongings." Lila's gaze pinned him. "They can try," she said, "and you can explain to their families why you let them." Gus noticed how Silas's hands trembled as he folded a map, not weakness, but the body's quiet confession that it understands risk. The mountain, above all of them, held its breath. Time slid forward in a strange, sticky way. Wind rose, then dipped, then rose again. The air became too warm for the amount of snow on the ground, a wrongness Gus could feel under his skin. Coda's nose worked constantly, pulling in invisible facts: diesel, sweat, pine sap, the faint sour tang of disturbed earth. Gus watched the dog more than he watched the sky. A man can lie with his mouth. A dog tells the truth with his body. Then it happened. Not a cinematic explosion, not a single dramatic crack. It started with a deep whoomph, a muffled settling sound that rolled through the valley floor like a giant exhale. The lights at the edge of town flickered. For one heartbeat, every voice stopped. Then the mountain roared. Snow and rock and broken timber surged down the north slope, not like water, but like a living wall ripping free of gravity's patience. It came in layered waves, first powder that leapt into the air like smoke, then heavier slabs that snapped trees as if they were matchsticks. The sound wasn't just loud, it was consuming, the kind of sound that fills your chest and makes it hard to remember you have lungs. Somewhere in that white fury, a road vanished. A transformer popped, sending a brief shower of sparks into the storm like tiny, desperate stars. Deputy Barnes swore under his breath, the bravado draining out of him fast. Silas's face went pale, and he whispered almost to himself, "There, that's the release plane." Lila didn't freeze. Her voice cut through the chaos over the radio. "All units, confirm head count. No one goes back up. Repeat, no one." Gus felt his heartbeat slow instead of spike, the old Marine training pressing down like a firm hand on a panicked animal. He turned to Coda. "We're moving," he said. Coda's ears snapped forward, ready. The avalanche didn't swallow the whole town, thank God, and maps and stubborn human movement, but it did carve a wound into the valley. A side road that served a handful of cabins and trailers was severed. Emergency lights flared near the edge of the slide path. People began shouting about someone not accounted for. A name came through the static. "Martha Keene." She went back for her dog. Another voice. "A family on Cedar Spur. Truck stuck." Lila's eyes met Gus's for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a request exactly, and it wasn't an order. It was recognition. This man and his dog were built for moving into danger when others had to hold the line. Gus nodded once. He didn't speak. Words were heavy and often unnecessary. He and Coda joined a small rescue team, and among them came a new medic, Caleb Drummond, early 30s, slender but strong, with sandy blonde hair plastered to his forehead under a helmet. His face was clean-shaven, eyes quick and kind, the kind of paramedic who made fear feel slightly embarrassed. He carried a trauma bag like it was part of his spine and introduced himself with a brief smile that said he'd learned humor was sometimes a bandage. "I heard you're the mountain guy," Caleb said to Gus as they climbed into a tracked utility vehicle. "Try not to prove it tonight." Gus's mouth twitched. "I'll do my best to disappoint you." The vehicle crawled toward the slide perimeter, treads grinding over packed snow. Floodlights showed the damage in harsh clarity. Trees snapped mid-trunk, chunks of ice the size of tables, a jagged scar in the hillside where the earth had been peeled open. Coda stood braced in the back, paws steady, nose high, body tense but controlled. Gus watched the dog scan the ground, avoiding areas that looked deceptively smooth. Coda's instincts weren't mystical, they were earned. Years of scent work, pain, survival. Still, in that night, the dog's certainty felt like something older than training, as if the mountain itself had chosen to speak through a creature that couldn't be bribed. They found the first crisis fast. A snowmobile tipped into a shallow ravine beside a stand of half-buried spruces. A teenager clung to it, face white, lips blue, one glove missing. The boy was Leo Jensen, 14, slim, messy brown hair peeking from under a beanie, bright eyes dulled by shock. He looked like someone who'd tried to be brave and got caught by physics. "My grandpa," he choked out, teeth chattering. "He's back there. He wouldn't leave." Gus scanned the slope. Coda sniffed once, then pulled right, hard, urgent. Gus followed, boots punching into drifts. Caleb trailed behind, breath fogging, muttering reassurances to keep the boy moving. They found the grandfather pinned by a fallen branch and snowpack, alive but trapped. An older man with a thin face and trembling hands, eyes wide with the humiliation of needing help. Gus and the rescue team worked with shovels and a saw, careful not to trigger secondary collapse. Coda stood at the edge, ears high, occasionally stepping in to paw at a spot where air moved differently. When they freed the man, Caleb checked his vitals and wrapped him in a foil blanket that crinkled like paper in a church. The old man stared at Gus, then at Coda. I thought I was done," he whispered. Gus answered with dry gentleness. "A lot of people think that. The mountain doesn't always agree." They loaded both into the vehicle and pushed on toward Cedar Spur. The road there had become a trap. Snow had drifted into deep, deceptive pockets, and the earth beneath had shifted. They found the family's truck half sunk near a bend, headlights still on like two stubborn eyes refusing to close. Inside were a mother and father, and a little girl, maybe 6, bundled in coats too big, cheeks red from cold, tears frozen on her lashes. The father, a broad man with a dark beard and frantic eyes, kept trying to rock the truck free, as if effort alone could bully winter into submission. "We couldn't get to the gym," he said, voice cracking. "The detour collapsed." Gus didn't scold him. Fear made fools of everyone. Coda sniffed the ground around the truck, then circled to the downhill side and stopped dead, body rigid. He let out a single, sharp bark. Gus approached slowly and saw what Coda had smelled. A new fissure in the snowpack, thin but lengthening, like a seam in cloth being pulled apart. The ground beneath was unstable, ready to slide again. "Out, now!" Gus commanded, voice suddenly all steel. The father stared, hesitating. Gus stepped closer, eyes blue-gray and unwavering. "Move. If you want your daughter to grow up, you move." That did it. The family scrambled out, the mother clutching the child to her chest. Caleb ushered them toward safety, while Gus and another rescuer clipped a tow line. They didn't save the truck. They saved the people. It was a trade Winter demanded, and Winter always collected its due. On the way back, Coda abruptly lunged toward a snowbank and began digging, fast, frantic, not playful. Gus thought at first it was a trapped animal. Then Coda's paws unearthed something small, a soaked red collar tag attached to a thin leash half buried, the metal warped. A tiny dog, trembling, white with patches of tan, was wedged in a hollow, barely breathing, eyes dull. Gus recognized it from the head count chatter. Martha Keene had gone back for her little dog. The collar tag read PIP. Coda nudged the tiny dog gently, not with dominance, but with care, like a big brother in a body meant for battle. Gus's chest tightened. He looked up into the storm-dark hillside and felt the strange sensation of being seen by something larger than himself. Not superstition, something simpler and heavier. The idea that doing the right thing creates ripples you can't predict. If Pine Haven had not evacuated, this little dog and the woman who loved him would have been swallowed by the mountain's anger. Gus lifted Pip, tucking the small body into his jacket against his own heat, and Coda pressed close, as if lending warmth through proximity alone. That small rescue, so minor compared to a whole town, hit Gus harder than the sirens. It reminded him that disasters aren't measured only in maps. They're measured in hearts. Back at the staging area, the gym buzzed with exhausted life. People huddled under blankets, sipping watery cocoa, sharing chargers and prayers. Lila moved through it all like a steady wind, checking lists, counting faces, making sure each name had a body attached. When Gus entered carrying the tiny dog, heads turned. A woman pushed forward, a senior with silver hair escaping a knit cap, cheeks flushed, eyes wet and furious with love. Martha Keene was in her early 70s, small but fierce, built like someone who'd spent her life refusing to be dismissed. She wore an old plaid coat, sleeves too long, and her hands shook as she reached for Pip. "Oh, you idiot," she whispered to the little dog, voice breaking. Then she looked at Gus. Her gaze moved from his uniform to his watch to his tired eyes, and her anger softened into gratitude. "I shouldn't have gone back," she admitted, swallowing hard. Gus's reply carried that dry humor that kept grief from drowning him. "Well, you did, so let's not make it a hobby." Martha barked a wet laugh, half sob, half relief, and hugged Pip to her chest like a treasure recovered from the underworld. Outside, the avalanche path lay quiet now, the mountain temporarily satisfied. Emergency management officials arrived at dawn, clipboards in hand, faces pale from the overnight reports. They weren't villains. They were people trained to document miracles, so the next one could happen on purpose. One of them, a woman in a reflective jacket with dark hair braided tight, introduced herself as Nora Feldman, mid-40s, brisk and professional, eyes kind behind the efficiency. She listened to Lila, reviewed Gus's photos, spoke with Silas. Her expression grew grim as she looked at the coordinate overlays. "Northline operations will be suspended pending investigation," she said, voice firm. "If there's evidence of unauthorized drilling near a known instability zone, that's criminal negligence." Silas exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for years, not hours. Lila's shoulders loosened slightly, though her face stayed focused. Gus didn't cheer. He'd learned justice rarely arrived with fireworks. It arrived with paperwork, consequences, and the slow turning of a heavy wheel. When it was safe enough, Gus returned to Kestrel Peak with Coda. The climb felt different now, less like retreat and more like responsibility. At the cabin, the porch light still hung like a small moon, frosted over. The shed door creaked open. Inside, the straw lay disturbed. The food dish was empty. But there were no bodies, no blood, no panic. Only a trail of paw prints, 4 small sets and 1 larger, leading away into the trees, straight and purposeful. The wolf mother had left before the mountain fell, moving her pups the way wild things do, without speeches, without gratitude, without asking permission. Gus stared at the tracks until his eyes burned. He didn't feel abandoned. He felt honored. The kind of honor a soldier feels when he realizes a life he protected has gone on without him, as it should. Coda sniffed the prints, then looked up at Gus, ears forward. Gus crouched, gloved hand resting briefly on the dog's shoulder. "Good call," he murmured. Not sure if he meant the wolf, the dog, or the strange chain of decisions that had turned an isolated veteran into a link in a town's survival. Later that week, Pinehaven gathered in the diner because that's what towns did when they needed to become a we again. The air smelled of coffee and bacon and the sweet, stubborn insistence of normal life. People who had once avoided Gus now pulled out chairs for him. Children approached Coda with permission, hands gentle, eyes wide. One little girl scratched Coda behind the ear and whispered, "You're the hero, dog." Coda sneezed and leaned into the touch, pretending not to enjoy it too much, but his tail thumped once against the floor like a quiet applause. Deputy Barnes, mustache still frosted at the edges from the storm, cleared his throat and held out his hand to Gus. The gesture looked awkward on him, like a man wearing unfamiliar clothes. "I was wrong," Barnes said, "about you, about the warning." Gus took the hand, firm grip, no drama. "Most people are wrong about mountains," he replied. "They forgive you once, if you're lucky." Silas raised a mug of coffee and a small toast. Lila watched from the counter, arms crossed, expression softened by exhaustion. In that moment, Gus understood the thing he'd been missing on his peak. Not noise, not crowds, but connection. Earned, not demanded. He went home and hammered a simple wooden sign onto a post near his cabin path. The letters weren't fancy. Gus wasn't fancy. Kestrel Shelter. Winter Warning Support. He didn't call it a sanctuary. He didn't claim ownership of mercy. He simply named what his door could be, a chance in the worst weather to live. Coda lay on the porch steps beside him that night, ears pricked to the forest, not with fear now, but with listening. The mountain was quiet, and the quiet felt different, less like loneliness and more like space where a new life could enter. Gus stared into the darkness where the wolf tracks had vanished and felt the smallest warmth inside his ribs, the kind that doesn't explode but endures. The wolf mother had come to his threshold because she had no other choice. He had opened a door because, somewhere deep, he still remembered the marine rule he'd tried to bury. You don't leave lives behind when you can carry them through the storm. Sometimes a miracle doesn't look like parted seas or a blinding light in the sky. Sometimes it looks like a door opened in the third night of a blizzard, a steady hand that doesn't shake when it would be easy to run, and a faithful dog whose instincts feel like a quiet sermon written in breath and paw prints. God often answers loud prayers with small mercies, warm shelter, a warning in time, a life spared by one decision made in love. If this story found you on an ordinary day, remember this. Heaven doesn't only move in sanctuaries. It moves in kitchens where someone forgives first, in parking lots where someone helps a stranger, in lonely houses where someone chooses kindness over comfort. The same God who watches over a mountain can watch over your hallway, your workplace, your worries, and your tomorrow. If you've ever felt like you're facing your own storm, take heart. Sometimes God sends a coda into your life, a nudge, a friend, a moment of clarity that keeps you from the edge. If this message spoke to you, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment telling where you're watching from and what storm you're walking through, and subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and grace. May God bless you and keep you. May He place His protection over your home and your family. And may He lead you safely through every winter until you find your spring.